I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, The Real ROI of Cloud, How to Calculate the ROI of Moving Complex Enterprise Applications to the Cloud. My name is Arlene Itori, and I'm a webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute, and it is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with Persistent Systems. I'll be working in the background to help answer any technical or general questions that you may have. But before we begin, I'd like to quickly tell you about a few tools that you'll be able to use throughout today's session. First, we encourage you at any time during the presentation to submit your questions to today's speakers. To do this, click on the questions box, type your question in the space provided, and click on the Submit button. We will be doing the Q&A following the presentation. During today's presentation, we'll be asking poll questions to get to know you better and to help ensure that the content is relevant to your specific needs. When the poll appears, be sure to select the answer that best fits each question. Today's webinar is being recorded. You will be receiving a follow-up email in approximately 2 days, which will include a link with today's recorded webinar. The webinar recording and the presentation slides will also be available at outsourcing.com. So without further ado, I will now turn it over to our moderator, Marty Pine, former Senior Vice President for ACE Insurance, for the formal introduction of today's speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Arlene. This is a great session. There's been a lot of hype about the cloud, and we're finally getting down into the reality. I think Persistent Systems and Cumulix have a great deal of experience. Kishore Balal, the VP of Cloud Sales for Persistent, will lead this session today. Kishore leads the sales and business development for cloud and mobility initiatives for Persistent Systems in North America. He possesses over 15 years of product management, sales, and business development experience, and has launched products and new lines of business for multinational companies. He has held leadership positions at Motorola, Lucent, private equity-backed mobility solutions companies. Kishore has an MBA from Columbia University, a master's in operations from the University of Delaware, and bachelor's in engineering from Bombay. He will be joined by John Schindler, who's the VP of Business Development for Cumulix, who will actually show an example of how the products have been used and take you into the practicality of what's going on. John has led sales, marketing, and partnerships for Cumulix for the past 2 years. Has guided Cumulix to be one of the top ISV and service cloud partners for Microsoft. Mr. Schindler possesses over 20 years of IT professional services, sales, and technology leadership experience. Prior to Cumulix, he held positions at Microsoft, SAIC, and Liberty Mutual, where he guided sustainable organizational changes, implemented advanced technologies, and led strategies integrating the business and IT. Mr. Schindler specializes in the multidimensional analysis of the cloud on organizations to include financial impact, operational change, and overall cloud fit analysis. His 10 years at Microsoft were focused on core leadership roles within worldwide services and support. So we have great speakers, an interesting topic. You know, cloud has been called the most important disruptive trend since the internet, and we're going to find out more about it shortly in our presentation. First, a little bit about the Outsourcing Institute, the sponsors of this program, along with Persistent. You can read all the details. The Outsourcing Institute has a network of outsourced professionals and buyers and sellers. It's a good source of information, advice, and best practices around outsourcing. To learn more about the Outsourcing Institute, please visit outsourcing.com. And there's also a sister company called CMS where we recruit outsourcing professionals. Arlene, go on to the next chart. And there's a series of roadshows. There's a fall roadshow. You can see the details. I'll be speaking at that myself. It's a follow-up to our successful innovations in outsourcing webinar, and this will be more in detail in terms of innovation and how to move the ball forward. Without further ado, I'll turn this over to Kishore to begin the presentation on the ROI of the cloud.
Thank you, Marty. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. As Marty said, we'll be talking about the ROI, the framework, the methodology, and the processes But before I dive into the presentation, the first couple of slides talk about persistent systems. Persistent Systems is a publicly listed company with over 20 years in business. We have over 300 plus customers, and our company has been always focused on building products for customers and taking them to market. So with that comes a lot of experience working right up front, mainstream with product management, organization, system engineering, architecture, then doing the actual development and validation testing and sending it to markets. So we have worked with our customers, ISVs, and enterprises getting products into the market. And what we're doing is some of the advantages we have gathered over the last 20 plus years, we are able to use some of the technology processes and now take it to the enterprise level. And that's the whole idea of what, when you start going onto the cloud, a lot of the legacy applications will really have a huge impact, and our experience helps here. Going into the next slide, these are our 4 trust areas, the building blocks for this decade and beyond. Like I said, cloud computing is our focus, mobility, enterprise mobility is a focus, so is analytics, building sentiment analysis, and the collaboration across not just internal organizations, but beyond with the entire ecosystem of partners. But where persistent systems really comes as a differentiator is to solve the entire problem holistically, look at the interdependencies and solve the problem and see how we can bring all these 4 trust areas together across any particular vertical, whether it is healthcare or financial systems or life sciences. And that's going to be how we will operate. While we will focus on the ROI, you'll realize how the innovation is going to fuel with the benefits you're going to get on this on the cloud. Now, going on to the slide, next slide, there's a lot of talk about cloud. I mean, if you look at the numbers floating around there, right, from 40 billion growth to 241 billion in the next in this decade, but these numbers have a lot of hardware, software, services, systems integration, and migration built into these numbers. So, including our CEO, who said it's the most important disruptive trend since the internet, Anand Deshpande, and if you look at the entire industry, what they're echoing, the idea is that we will be able to spend the next 6 to 12 months, enterprises, CIOs, business organizations are going to spend the next 6 to 12 to 18 months focusing on where the return is going to be, what's the roadmap to go and build out their applications on cloud or migrate some of the legacy applications. So why all the hype? If I had to summarize this in a single sentence, it's a pay-as-you-go model. The scalability of the cloud is humongous for a majority of the organizations. The elasticity, capital expenditure, although interest rates are low and access to capital is getting very, very difficult. So it becomes very important you have a higher asset utilization, a capital utilization, but still you got to fund innovation. So it's very important for us not to over provision and build business cases in the classic client server models. The economic conditions are now fueling the momentum where the benefits which you're getting from the returns you get from the cloud, the options are increasing too. So the economics is going to just fuel the momentum. So as you go into this next 6 to 12 to 3 to 5 year period, you're going to see the rapid acceleration of adoption of cloud in the near future. But to many of us, many of the enterprises, what we realize in our own experience while working with the different companies, there are different challenges. There are the technological challenges where we have financial companies and healthcare saying, well, we are different. We have mission critical applications. Well, we have rigid compliance, Sarbanes-Oxley, HIPAA for healthcare, PCI for financial environments. So each industry has its own regulations, processes. Some industries are latency sensitive. If you're in healthcare, genomic accessing a lot of data, then you want a latency sensitive environment. Some applications are very customized, they need to be customized heavily. So we have heard enterprise say, well, banks say they're different. Then there are the business issues. Small and medium and big enterprises have multi-year contracts where, with preferred suppliers managing their IT contracts. Then there's this question on, do I move the legacy or new? And then there are different options. Do I do private cloud? Do I do hybrid? Do I go full public? What are my options? Which platforms do I use? So with all this mist, we created a framework and said, how do we make this happen so it's easy for enterprises to go? So Persistent has a cloud assessment framework, and I'll talk about the tool in a minute, but we have a cloud assessment framework where it's a simple 6-step process. The number one step is to identify all the deployed applications in enterprise. And in our case, we've deployed this tool in our own company and many customers. You'll be surprised there are so many homegrown applications we get to see for the first time over a course of 20, 30 years. The second part of the step is to analyze the workloads and the business heuristics for each application and say, okay, over a 4-week period, how does this really affect and what are the peak to average ratios? That's the analysis of the workload part. The third step is recommending an IT strategy. Do I do on-premise? Not everything can move on to the cloud. Do I do a hybrid? And what are my options before you even select a platform? The fourth step is, of course, the ROI analysis, and we have a framework here. And then the last 2 steps are some of the standardized monitoring tools where you need to monitor key performance indicators, dashboards, which simplify the system administration piece, and then access the cloud migration feasibility. Do I need to rewrite the code? Do I need to, what else do I need to do? Next slide. So before calculating the ROI, the number one important step, as I said, was identifying and categorizing applications deployed in the enterprise, and then benchmark them. So it's very simple to say all my applications are mission critical or they're in a different category. So we classified the loads as tier 1, which is basically, when I say mission critical, I mean by security, performance, availability, and the need for using customized hardware or infrastructure. Tier 2 could be still highly critical in security, but need not be, in terms of infrastructure, you may be able to leverage generic infrastructure. Tier 3 is pretty much can go into public cloud right away. And our model assumes there's a separate pool of resources tied to each tier. Typically, that's the case because that's how different tier of workload need different pool of resources. And then the alternatives go how you want to categorize the application, how do you really calculate the ROI. For example, in tier 1, it could be leveraging something you have from tier 2 to tier 3, which basically implies you really don't need to buy new storage or VMs, etc. For tier 2, it could mean running a private and public cloud in parallel, putting the secured workloads in private, moving some of the applications into public. Tier 3 is moving everything into public and then analyzing it. So that's the alternatives we go. So going into the slide, Persistent Cloud Assessment Tool is part of the framework, which really goes, the first step now is to now discover the applications. You can actually, enterprises can really go and discover applications either the agent-based method or really agentless, which basically means you don't have to install on every server. It goes and snips into different servers, looks at web applications, payroll, whatever you have specific to your organization. We've got healthcare companies who have over 800 applications in their enterprise, and with all the mergers and acquisitions, they have multiple applications, multiple servers, multiple databases, and the assessment tool goes and steps out different applications. Then we run a 4-week test. I'll go back to the previous slide if you can. Then we do a 4-week test on the workload patterns and database discovery and say, okay, this is how the workload looks. And then you apply the scores and say, what are the 4 quadrants? Which one can move on to the cloud? What is a real mission critical? And that's how we categorize. This tool gives a full list of application and scores of what can and cannot go on the cloud. Next slide. So now coming back to the ROI framework, the 3 metrics when it comes to benefits. The first one is cost reduction. How can I quantify the savings in terms of moving onto the cloud? Whether you go hybrid or private or public, pick the cloud, there's a cost reduction aspect to it. The second aspect to it is the balancing the cost reduction is the productivity enhancement. How efficient do I get by moving to the cloud? And then the accelerator is the revenue transformation. Can I leverage some of the savings into some new ideas which fund innovation, which enterprises need to get ready for? And then you've got, of course, there are costs to the cloud. Although it moves from a CapEx to an OpEx, you still have some costs which you have to move a legacy application or you're taking a new application, you still have cloud costs. So you subtract the two to get a return on investment. And hopefully the next few slides will talk about how we come up with some of the numbers. So going into the slide which talks about the number 1 bullet is the cost reduction. So in cost reduction, again, I want to put a disclaimer because these are ranges and it's very specific to every enterprise. So numbers could be vastly different based on how you want to manage your enterprise. Is the labor cost. The labor cost is the number 1 savings, and we believe depending on the tier you pick, tier 1 or tier 2 or tier 3, you can get anywhere from 33 to 50%. And a simple example is a person to server ratio improves from 1 person to 5 servers to 1 to 10 or 1 to 15, and whatever the team is comfortable with within the enterprise. The second major component of cost reduction is the software. When you move into a OpEx mode of paying into software, you're not buying it up front, so there's a better utilization. And then there is application development and maintenance fees which you don't have to pay. The third most important reason is the upgrades you do are now done at the web level versus doing it at every individual machine and pushing upgrades to all machines. We believe it's a 10 to 20% savings. Finally, the hosting aspect of it, we believe is a 5 to 12%. Again, subjective, but the capacity required for tier 2 and tier 3, how they get repurposed for using for tier 1, which is a mission critical application. How do we efficiently use the asset utilization, the peak to average ratio for tier 1 applications, then the real estate savings, the electricity, the cooling, and all the other costs. The total cloud savings potential, we believe, could be between 50 to 70%. That's really huge in any enterprise. So we can pick and say not everything needs to go on the cloud, but even with all the analysis, we believe the savings is tremendous. Next slide, please. On the productivity enhancement, we said, okay, this is the second part of the equation, which is like a scale which balances out the cost reduction. Okay, if I'm going to save 50 to 70%, then what does it mean in terms of application development, which is a major component of productivity enhancement? We have done work on Microsoft Azure and Force.com, and we believe that building apps on a platform as a service, PaaS framework, building apps required 25 to 50% less effort. The toolkits, the standardized UIs which we can use without much customization, the benefits are tremendous. The maintenance cost, let's face it, when you have legacy applications over the course of time, the maintenance costs keep increasing, products don't get updated, and let's not forget the infrastructure needed for supporting the scaling, backups, additional infrastructure users, all that adds to maintenance for 20%. Some of these could move into different buckets, but the idea is that it is definitely an issue. And then the open source leverageability. In some cases, many cases it may not apply, but in many cases it does apply, where you can replace a lot of application servers with Tomcat and Optimize. Can we use open source code? So while you look at the total productivity, we still believe there's at least a 45 to 70 to 60% savings on the productivity enhancement. So the organization does get very efficient when we look at the productivity. So on the revenue transformation slide, we've done all the savings from the cost reduction, the productivity enhancement, the reinvestment of capital to fund innovation, and here are some ideas, and each organization have different ideas. For education and learning, vertical, a multi-billion-dollar company on the East Coast, we have talked about implementing a cloud-based mobile framework to drive productivity in an enterprise mobility setting. What that does is, for students entering into their freshman year in college, where they're using iPads and Droids and what have you in tablets, you're imparting education not just to desktops but to mobility. So the integration becomes key, and a lot of the savings you already get out of moving on to the cloud, now you can get into the smartphone and mobility setting, and this gets you more revenue. So you're now going from a cost side to a revenue side, which you would normally not be able to fund or prioritize. The collaboration, whether you're sharing data with vendors, customers across organizations, or an investor relation meeting which you have once a quarter and you have to distribute loads of document where you have usage patterns which are very, very random. This is huge because you're now collaborating, everyone's looking at the same. Just look at today's meeting. We're all sharing information across multiple firewalls very easily, and that's how we're able to share some of the experiences. And we can make it all mobile, so a lot of the iPads and tablets, Droids out there, we can leverage in Windows Phone 7 devices. The most important point, which is equally important, is the integration of social media. Nowadays, if you have an issue on, let's say, how to fix your television, the improvement of customer service, people Google it. People go to Facebook. People go to YouTube to figure out how to solve. So to enhance the customer service, it becomes very important to integrate the social media standard APIs into your cloud and mobility network. And we have already been doing these kind of integrations to some of the companies. They're already seeing improvement in customer service, which translates to a lot of the revenue increases as we start funding some of the savings into the social media and the enterprise mobility and cloud framework. Next slide. So we have to talk about the cloud costs, because we do say, yes, moving from the balance sheet to the income statement, but at the end of the day, there are still costs. The number one item is the cloud platform cost, or the subscription platform cost for Azure or Force.com. Then there are transaction costs. How many times do you access? There are definitely, the numbers are getting lower and lower by the day, but there's still costs. Then how about one-time development costs? Who pays? If I'm taking a legacy application and migrating it to the cloud, there's a one-time cost. There's a rewriting of the code. Sometimes you can leverage .NET. Sometimes you may have to pick up the newer languages which are proprietary. So there are applications you need to port, and these are all one-time costs. And then you have the standardized monitoring tools which make sure that you have the same look and feel what you're used to. All these risks impact the unquantifiable downtime and compliance issues. Do take dampen the savings a little bit. In our view, it's 10 to 15% of reduction because of on the overall ROI, because of some of these cloud costs which come, which impact the ROI. Because at the end of the day, how you migrate depends on the cost too. So, but still the savings are there. I think, Arlene, are we ready for maybe a poll question here?
Yes,
And,
I'll pull that up right now, Kishore.
Thanks, Arlene.
Mm-hmm.
We have a quick poll question. We talked about the ROI and the benefits. Just very curious how you or your company have tried to calculate the ROI of moving to the cloud or a specific application. Have you ever tried to do it to calculate an ROI? If so, it'll be interesting to see whether it's a yes or a no, simple yes or no, and Arlene will will get the results in probably a minute. But please let us know if you or your company have tried to calculate the ROI of moving to the cloud. Any application, a set of applications, that'll be great. So overall, in conclusion, there is a lot of benefits to the cloud. There's definitely a prioritization matters, whether you move a legacy or a new app. It does matter you have a cost reduction savings or you go with productivity enhancement. It all depends on what you're comfortable with. And finally, integration of social media and going into the revenue, is definitely new ways of finding revenue will be the key. Interesting, we just got the poll results, and 43% of you said yes, they've tried to calculate the ROI, and 57% said no. So it's a pretty good number. So thanks, Arlene. We had the results. So with this, I'm done with my slides. In the conclusion, the assessment will be the key piece, and the tool is the key piece, and the process is the key piece to get the ROI. With this, I want to hand you over to John Schindler from Cumulux. Cumulux is our customer and also a partner in some of the engagements. Handing over to John.
All right. Thank you, Kishore. First off, I just want to provide a little background on Cumulux. We've been in business since September of 2008, and as a company, we are focused on all things related to the cloud. And like Persistent, we have done work on a variety of platforms, Force.com, Amazon, as well as Windows Azure. And as time has gone by, we have evolved our business model to focus mainly on Azure today. We see a lot of value in that as a platform as a service, and we have now helped over 65 customers make that migration to the cloud. And so over those 3 years of being in business, we've gained quite a bit of perspective and insight onto the decision factors that help drive a customer to adopting the cloud as part of their overall architecture. We operate as a hybrid business model. We are both an ISV. We produce a product called Managed Access, which helps customers operationalize their cloud applications and to provide monitoring, management, provisioning, and governance of their applications. And as well, we provide cloud enablement services to help customers make that transition. And as Kishore pointed out, we are a close partner with Persistent. We have collaborated on projects together. Some of them have been quite interesting, involving net new applications going to the cloud. And so it's been a very fruitful partnership, and very excited to have been the opportunity to present our perspective on adopting the cloud in your organizations. So next slide. So before I get into the business case itself, I wanted to share a couple perspectives on the economics, or as what we call the cloudonomics of moving applications into the cloud. There are a number of factors that we see that impact that decision process, and one involves peak planning or capacity planning for your application. In the traditional IT scenario, you try to estimate what those peaks would be, but often that results in either overinvestment or underutilization of those resources. So the other side of the coin here is the on-demand nature of the cloud. So you provision application capability to the cloud based on what you see the demand being from a steady state, and then also understanding what scenarios may increase the necessity to acquire additional resources. As well, with the cloud, the unit cost and the overall TCO tends to be lower for many of our customers, and frankly that's achieved through the economies of scale that cloud providers deliver to their customers. These economies of scale are simply just the efficiency of supporting many customers on their platforms and their data centers, and that savings ultimately is passed on to the customer. And then finally, the pay-as-you-go model is very compelling for a number of our customers. It entails using and paying for what you use and no more, and optimizing the use of those resources. And it's also a conversion from an operating or from a capital expense, generally when you invest in capital for new servers, new technologies and hardware in your data center, those can be fairly high cost. Now you control this and operate more as an operating expense within your organization. And these are the four kind of key factors that we take into account when we help customers work through the decision-making process. Next slide. Another important factor to take into consideration, we like to look at the reason for going to the cloud technically is the different workload patterns that you would see for your application. There are the four main scenarios that we see working quite well and quite conducive to the cloud. Includes on-demand, compute-intensive, multi-enterprise integration, and then bursting. For on-demand, we're working with a customer today who has an e-commerce application that supports millions of users across the globe. And for most of a fiscal month, the use of that application is fairly low. And in their analysis, they found that 60% of orders that are submitted in their system occur within a 2-hour period during that 30-day period. So this is where the cloud tends to be a very viable solution for this particular customer, because it allows them to scale up and scale down resources depending on what predictive patterns they have within their organization. Then you have compute intensive. And this is an interesting scenario where simulation is required and quite a bit of compute capacity and parallel processing is necessary to provide data and information analysis to the customers. In this case, we've worked with hedge funds that like to use the cloud to do their financial modeling, and they saw the benefit of moving from a batch scenario to more real-time processing. And there's a multi-enterprise, and the case study that I'll be going through actually sort of entails this scenario where with today's technology, in particular Windows Azure, allows secure access to on-premise data and allows the aggregation and collection of that data for additional analysis or potentially new services that you want to put in place to support business intelligence and those type of scenarios. And then bursting, and the scenario that we worked in here is around emergency response systems. So emergencies only hopefully occur infrequently, but when they do occur, and the example I'm using is when the disaster struck in Japan, particularly around the nuclear power plants, the number of users hitting sites to get information increased dramatically. And there was one site in Japan that actually had 45 million users within a day hitting the site. So here is a scenario where most of the time the application operates in a very basic mode, but when something happens, the usage climbs dramatically, and here you can scale and gather additional resources. So these are the four main workload patterns that we see customers applying. But the thing to keep in mind that the cloud is not a pure outsourcing scenario. It's not an all or nothing scenario. It actually, what we see with many of our customers is they tend to go to hybrid scenarios where they extend the capability of their current application environment by putting workloads that can be integrated with the legacy applications out into the cloud, and thus extending the capabilities. So next slide. So for this case study, it involves a very large manufacturing ISV that intuitively saw the benefits of moving to the cloud. They focus on process control software. They have a very widely distributed customer base, and like a lot of successful organizations, have a complex legacy architecture that made it somewhat difficult to sort of figure out what's the best place to start to move workloads and capabilities to the cloud. Now in this scenario, I'm a big fan of tools and methodologies and reuse of experiences that you gain working with customers, but sometimes based on the uniqueness of the situation and the customer environment, it requires that you go in and basically just roll up your sleeves and really spend quite a bit of time gathering and discovering information about the environment so that you can paint a fairly complete picture of what's going on in the environment, what's going on in their market, and what it's going to take to actually make a smart move to the cloud and do it basically with your eyes wide open. And in this case study, and I expect that there will be a number of attendees for this webinar that are on the enterprise side in more traditional data centers and IT environments, and there could be ISVs. But the lessons learned here are frankly applicable to any type of organization looking to move to the cloud. So what we did, we came in, helped this customer figure out where to get started, which apps made the most sense for moving to the cloud. We applied what we call a multidimensional assessment, and not just looking at the financial implications, but also looking at the technical implications. And so in doing our analysis in parallel, we also conducted a proof of concept to allow this customer to start getting some technical hands-on with the technology and proving out that components of their application could actually reside on the cloud and work very effectively. Next slide. So as an ISV, an independent software vendor that produced products that they sold to their customers, they looked at three main options before they engaged us. They were looking at one, peripheral web enablement to add additional capability. However, they viewed this as sort of a me too or catch-up mode relative to their competition. So in our analysis, we did look at the competitive landscape. We'll see what advantages to be gained by moving to the cloud. They were also, while very successful in their environment, they had pretty much saturated their current market environment and were really looking for scenarios that allow them to repeat that startup story, what made them successful in the past. So implementing hybrid scenarios, implementing a cloud app engine that was a subset of the current architecture and running on, in this case, Windows Azure, made a lot of sense to them, and then realizing that some of the other legacy components that were in their application that were older technologies, they realized would have to require some rework. In this case, the COM to the WCF, Windows Communication Foundation, to actually make it a more up-to-date environment. And of course, they looked at acquisition, but given the newness of the cloud environment, there weren't many options out there for them to acquire this capability out in the open market. Next slide. So basically what we did from a financial standpoint, we went in and did quite an extensive amount of analysis to vet out the different options that were presented to this customer. We're a big fan of using net present value analysis in our assessments. The reason we do it, one, it's great for quantifying the different options that might be available to a customer and putting it down to black and white numbers that allow you to make better choices. But with net present value techniques, it allows you to look at, one, the investment that's going to be required to make a migration happen in the organization. It looks at the total cost of ownership, but also looks out into the future on implications that may exist for the business model overall. So in this scenario, we found that there would be increase of customer penetration by going and developing software as a service versus staying in a traditional model where their software is deployed on-premise to their customers. The other net result was lower operation cost for them. They support a number of manufacturing facilities, so we found that the cost per plant to operate dropped to $85 per plant per month, which was a substantial savings. It also allowed for faster customer ramp up, so that by inherently doing it this way, it allowed the operational cost to also decrease. There's not as much on-premise deployment. There wasn't as much reliance on additional resources to get an application running on site. The cloud, the pure cloud, leveraging platform as a service, the net present value for this particular scenario, and we looked out over a 3-year period, came out to about $4.4 million, which was the highest NPV value, which made it the most sensible choice for them to move forward. but in doing it, we recognized there were higher migration costs, but they would recoup this cost over that 3-year period, so it made it a very smart investment for them overall. And you can see here on the table, we lay out the options from a traditional model to a VM-based, a virtual machine-based model, to a pure platform as a service to enable their capabilities to service their customers. And we found that the potential for new customer acquisition, greater penetration of existing customers, and creating new revenue sources also became very apparent. For the customer, they also saw a lot of benefits. Once again, just like in this case, the ISV, the customer now is converting from a capital expense to an operating expense. They're no longer installing licensed software on premise. They were leveraging the cloud. Their cost per month would drop. The lower ongoing TCO for the customer also dropped. There was lower operational costs for them. And also, from a marketing standpoint, there was a lower barrier to adoption, providing trial periods, letting customers get quick access to the software, all became very compelling. Of course, this also presented some challenges to their current business model. They worked in the traditional reseller distributor model. They leveraged system integrators to customize and implement their software, and of course there were implications on the customers and the users themselves. So in moving down this path strategically, they recognized there would have to be a number of changes to take place within their organization as well. So kind of quickly summarize here, we did the net present value based on their traditional pricing, pricing based on a virtual machine, a VM-based cloud offering, and then going pure cloud. And that's down in the lower right-hand corner. And when you're looking and using NPV, you're generally looking at a handful of options. In this case, the higher NPV tells you that's the option and the direction that you want to take. So the customer has then now embarked on implementing this strategy. Next slide. But we go a bit beyond just providing the financial analysis and spreadsheets that lay out the financial implications for the customer. We also provide deliverables, one that we call a heat map, that allows you to sort of plot out the different applications. And the goal here is to identify solutions that, one, benefit from the cloud, assess the feasibility of doing it, and then assess the impact on the overall business model. And we do this by evaluating a number of different dimensions. In this case, for this customer, the mission criticality of the application, the hardware dependencies, the plant connectivity, ease of deployment, and then a phased approach versus all cloud. And the findings were that cloud was most pronounced with distributed integration of on-premise applications. In this scenario, it allowed what are traditionally very secure environments, factories or plants that have sometimes multiple firewalls, leveraging the Windows Azure technology, access control services, and App Fabric that allows secure access to on-premise data. And here they were able to create a service that otherwise wouldn't be implementable under traditional models. So they were able now to provide manufacturing intelligence, allowing their customers now to effectively gather data almost in a real-time scenario from distributed plants and gather it up into an overall sort of a performance model for their manufacturing facilities. And in some cases, some of these customers had 300, 400, 500 plants distributed across the globe. So the heat map becomes a very useful tool in articulating internally what are the options that are presented by moving to the cloud and communicating it through the organization. Next slide. Now this, I realize, looks a bit like a radar return to a major airport. And also I want to point out, I'm not highlighting who this customer is because frankly if I presented all this information with their details, I'd be revealing their 3-year strategic plan. So I'm trying to mask the different applications, and so the names I picked here are all just proxies for the real application. And I should point out that some of these names look kind of familiar and relevant to Texas. My son's a freshman at the University of Texas, so I chose to go down this path. But what this slide actually represents is a roadmap for this particular customer, plotting the application and the phases of evolving particular components of the application to the different platforms, from virtualized appliances to the VM cloud workloads to a pure platform as a service, but also then plotting against what then would be the ongoing business objectives that would be achieved by moving these application components and staging them through different phases in the evolution towards the cloud. This was a very useful tool for them to communicate internally in their organization. Next slide. So what success looked like for them, it really involved market share disruption, unseating current competitors and dominant incumbents in other parts of the marketplace of a lower cost offering. The pricing business model changed dramatically for them, moving from the traditional license fees to now an annuity model, revenue per month. Of course, this necessitates changes to how salespeople are compensated, and it required them thinking of a scenario to kind of bridge the compensation models to help the sales organization make that transition. And of course, infrastructure as a service using VMs became a useful stepping stone. And overall, they just saw that this technique would allow them to grow and acquire new and more customers faster than they had been able to in the past. And next slide. So in summary, the cloud impact on the return on investment for this particular customer that we articulated in the form of net present value, it increased revenue through greater customer upsell potential and new market penetration. It allowed for faster customer onboarding and greater productivity, which reduced operational costs for the customer here in this case, as well as their customers moving forward, and lowered the overall operational cost for users and customers going forward. And then, of course, what I like is around net present values, it really effectively addresses all the different factors that you have to look at in your organization, and not just looking at it from one dimension. It accounts for the upfront investment, the increased potential revenue, new revenue sources. It looks at OpEx versus CapEx, and looks at TCO. So I know I flew through those slides pretty quickly, but that ends my portion of the presentation, and I think at this point we now want to open up for questions.
Yeah, great. Kishore and John, thank you very much. We do have a bunch of questions from our participants. Let me start with one, I think, for Kishore specifically. Can you provide more information about the porting of applications? What sort of applications are easy to port and less costly?
Yeah, I think good question. I think in terms of porting of applications, what we look at is where it's a typical, let's say, a ticket you try to troubleshoot, incident help desk. Those are very typically easier to go and move to the cloud, a full public cloud. When it comes to things which are more consumer level, those are very easy business cases, because at the end of the day, it lowers the total cost of ownership, because and that's typically easy. The second thing is which is not the cost savings part. The applications which really make are, believe it or not, with new applications versus porting a legacy application, because sometimes legacy applications end up, how deep you have to go into the platform involves a lot of rewriting and could end up being a one-year project. Typically not, but it could end up being how complex it is. So it's a very depends answer. But then when you go into a new application, let's say a mobility application, doing a cloud-based mobility application is much easier. The ROI is much higher. I mean, people watch movies and emails and everything on the smartphone nowadays. Listening to music, so it's all delivered via the cloud. So I think putting a new application is definitely number one, and then number two, of course, porting an application which is more consumer, focused is the next best, I would say.
Thanks, Kishore. I have a question I think I'd like Kishore and John both to answer. John, we'll start with you. How will corporate culture, meaning culture with modest computing skills that is significantly dependent on local support, factor into the overall ROI calculation?
Okay, that's an interesting question. Could you repeat that one more time? I want to make sure I...
Sure. How will corporate culture, meaning a culture with modest computing skills that is significantly dependent on local support, factor into the overall ROI calculation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I understand it. One, I think you have to look at the uniqueness of your particular scenario and the readiness of an organization to make this change. Often, and in our technology and the product that we provide, Managed Access, that provides what would be the traditional kind of dashboard and visibility into cloud applications. The problem with operational organizations is that they have to evolve from just being a sole operator of resources that they have on premise to now integrating third-party capabilities, and that all in our mind comes down to the visibility and control that you have over those applications. But from an impact perspective, I think the operational requirements become simpler in managing the cloud, because now you're not managing that entire stack, but there is probably a training cost, there's a readiness cost that will have to be addressed in moving forward.
Yeah, and just to add what John said, I think it's a perfect scenario to go to the cloud. If you look at, let's say, a medical small business practice with 50 or 100 employees, what happens is they cannot afford the IT or computing needs. So even if they have, let's say, a small IT administration with 2 or 3 people with modest computing needs, going to the cloud is probably the best option, because they rather utilize the resources for more effective use than doing more things which are not centric to what would they want.
Yeah, and I'll add, in a pure cloud scenario, if you look at the full stack from the network to the hardware itself, the data administrator, what happens is you're really now just responsible for 2 main components. It's the application health itself. The system and the operating environment is held by that third party and managed by a third party with very specified SLAs that are in place, and then you also have to worry about managing the data. So it tends to narrow the focus from an operational standpoint.
Thanks for your answers, guys. Another question I think you both can take a shot at. How do you factor the vendor risk given the amount of new companies and the uncertainty if they go bankrupt? Kishore, you want to?
The vendor risk, for a new company, if you look at the options available on the cloud, and I hope I'm addressing it right, the companies who are backing, especially in the platform side, are the companies like Microsoft and on the entire PaaS and Salesforce.com, who are very, very robust in nature. And you're moving just like how you would deal with a piece of hardware or software which you buy, procure today. Just visualize that you're actually going to use it on much more standardized hardware and standardized web operating systems. Now the question is, to do the migration, when you work with companies like Persistent, Cumulus, and everyone like the like who have experience, you're not looking at ongoing support. You're looking at more transforming your costs to newer ways of revenue. So I don't know if going into bankruptcy is something the CFO organization would do its own due diligence on how viable the vendors are, and to begin with.
Yeah, and I would add that, and one thing I didn't include in the case study, but something we have provided the customer, is also risk analysis and making sure that all that is addressed and that you go through the due diligence in your vendor selection. And even if a company, say like Microsoft, who's not going to go away anytime soon, they've invested tremendous amounts of money into their data centers across the globe and have implemented some of the most efficient and the best, and ultimately the best practices to run their environments. So the risk level tends to be diminished when you go to a company like that. But if you're looking at other firms who aren't sort of yet in the mainstream, due diligence is really important to factor into your decision process.
All right, a question for Kishore. You mentioned 3 different potential ROI benefits for moving to the cloud. From your experience with clients, what is the primary reason they look at the cloud? Cost savings, productivity enhancements, or revenue transformation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the cost reduction, probably that mantra has been repeated many times. We've just quantified it to a level which organizations can be more comfortable with. But the number one reason, I think, for us, which we are seeing, is then the productivity enhancement, because supporting legacy applications, buying legacy software, getting infrastructure, it's almost passe. And the companies need to innovate by moving into newer sources of revenue, reaching to a different class of people, and this is the generation which is going to access content via with the mobile interface. So to go there, it's very important that productivity and revenue transformation become the key metrics going forward. And that is what we're seeing, at least in the education learning vertical, the media vertical. The cost savings is almost like a given. It has to happen. So the latter two play a bigger role.
Great, Kishore. One last question. In terms of ROI, which is usually better, building a new application on the cloud or moving a legacy application?
I would say a new application is much cleaner because from a cost perspective, you don't have to worry about rewriting and moving and migrating and having business cases justified. Legacy application is where you see the returns of savings, and you can use that extra savings to transform your business into newer sources. But a newer application is definitely cleaner to implement because you start getting into the productivity enhancements right then and there, and you see a huge benefit of making it more efficient.
Yeah, and I would add also that the hybrid scenarios are quite common, and I'll go back to where I mentioned the hedge fund scenario. In that case, they had already an on-premise application, but it was a batch application that ran overnight into analysis on a variety of different indices and what they call baskets of stocks and measuring it against indices. Well, batch processing isn't real-time, and what the cloud allowed was more real-time calculations for this particular firm, and thus their data was better, their productivity was better, but it was still integrating to the on-premise application, but it was new capability that they did not have in place.
Yeah, and that's a great point, John, because I think if you look at the roadmap, when you look at the options you have, whether it's private, cloud, or public, or hybrid, what we are seeing, as John said, is hybrid cloud. The people are taking it in steps. Some are being bold to go all the way public. When there is real benefit because security and compliance is being addressed, and bandwidth and other issues are being solved. So definitely the hybrid scenario is where we're seeing a lot of demand.
All right, guys, thanks. I think we're about running out of time. I thank you for an informative and important presentation. The people who have attended will get a follow-up with an email directing them to a copy of the recorded version of the presentation. I want to thank Kishore from Persistent Systems and John from Cumulux and the Outsourcing Institute for being the sponsors of this, and we'll look forward to talking to you again on the next webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.